Heavy fighting continues across Ukraine, but gains have been made against Russian troops on some fronts. Ukrainian officials claim to have taken back towns 35 kilometres east of Kyiv, forcing Russian troops to retreat. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has criticised EU leaders for acting too late to stop Russia's invasion. We have more from Lviv and from Brussels in a while, but first a look at the battlefronts in Ukraine.
Russian troops may have stalled at the gates of Kyiv, but gun battles continue to rage across parts of the country. Ukrainian forces have been trying to encircle Russian troops in the suburbs of Irpin, Bucha, and Hostomel. Those areas have been turned into ruins under continued Russian fire. Ukraine's military says it has so far managed to repel enemy forces fighting their way into the capital. It also claims to have destroyed a flotilla of Russian warships near the port city of Berdyansk. The large ship, known as the Orsk, can transport up to 20 tanks or 40 armored personnel carriers. Images from the scene showed a large Russian warship ablaze, while two other vessels quickly steamed away from the inferno. Ramping up the air assault, Russian forces have launched multiple strikes on the eastern city of Kharkiv.
На меня падает потолок. Ну, все, я сейчас переоделся. Вот. И начал, сюда выхожу, а тут уже все разрушено. Вот. Тут двухэтажный домик стоял. Вот. Его разрушило. Вот. И все.
At least 4 people were killed after bombs hit a Kharkiv clinic, which was being used to distribute humanitarian aid. Emergency workers have been working round the clock to contain multiple fires. Thick columns of smoke billowed for hours after Russian forces struck this fuel depot outside Kyiv.
Высокоточными крылатыми ракетами морского базирования «Калибр» нанесен удар по базе горючего в населенном пункте Калиновка под Киевом. Уничтожена крупнейшая из оставшихся у вооруженных сил Украины топливных баз, с которой осуществлялось снабжение горючим воинских частей в центральной части страны.
In hard-hit Mariupol, the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. Officials estimate some 300 people were killed in last week's strike on a theater building in the port city. Until now, no death toll had been released, as massive piles of debris and relentless shelling have made it hard to verify. It's believed between 500 and 1,000 women and children were sheltering at the theater before the attack. A humanitarian corridor is expected to open in Mariupol, but only for those who can leave in private cars. Hundreds of thousands have been trapped in the city for weeks. Ukraine's president has criticized Europe for acting too late to stop Russia's invasion.
Ви застосували санкції. Ми вдячні. Це потужні кроки, але це було трошечки пізно. Бо якби це було превентивно, Росія не пішла б війною, ну принаймні, ніхто точно не знає, принаймні був шанс. Північний потік-2 ви заблокували, ми вам вдячні, і це правильно. Але це також було трошки запізно. Бо якби було вчасно, Росія не створила би газову кризу, принаймні був такий шанс.
Western leaders have promised Ukraine more military and humanitarian aid, but have stopped short of President Zelensky's pleas for a no-fly zone over the country.
Now, the European Union's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been complicated by the bloc's dependence on Russia for natural gas. But a deal struck just hours ago between the EU and the United States is designed to reduce that dependence on Russian energy. Ross Cullen joins us from Brussels. Ross, is this LNG deal sufficient, large enough to meet Europe's demand?
Yeah, Jill, that was the outcome of the meetings this morning between Joe Biden, the US president, and Ursula von der Leyen, the head of the EU Commission, signing off on this new partnership deal between the US and the EU to try to help the EU reduce its dependence on Russian oil and Russian gas. The United States is going to be providing additional capacity of liquefied natural gas to Europe, and over the coming years, ideally before the end of the decade, the EU says it wants to be able to achieve independence from relying on Russian oil and Russian gas imports. So that is the basis of the plan. There's going to be additional capacity created, additional infrastructure set up. Also, all of it has to be environmentally certified. That was part of the green transitional side of the deal as well, trying to reduce emissions while also trying to increase and boost that capacity of United States gas coming into Europe. That really has been a sticking point in the negotiations between European Union leaders, trying to find a path to agree on a potential fifth round of sanctions to be imposed on Russia. They really want energy to be part of that, if you're looking at the point of view of states like Poland and the Baltic states. But other EU members are hesitant to rush headlong into a sanctions package of restrictive measures that would take into account punitive measures on Russian oil and Russian gas imports into the EU. So a lot of discussions at EU level to try to work out how they can design their package of sanctions. But in terms of the US-EU agreement, the US has said that we do know that there will be costs to Europe as it tries to reduce its reliance on Moscow in terms of its energy mix. The US saying it's ready to step up and help the EU with that additional capacity.
And talk to us also, Ross, about the expectations and outcomes from US President Joe Biden's visit to Poland.
Yes, that is where he is going right now. He has finished his business here in Brussels, a day and a half of summits and meetings with NATO yesterday, with the G7 summit, also attending the European Union summit. And then this morning, as we were just talking about his meetings with Ursula von der Leyen, he is now en route to Poland, a key US ally, a member of NATO, a member of the European Union. He'll be following in the steps of his deputy. US Vice President Kamala Harris was also in Poland a few weeks ago. Joe Biden will be in Poland to meet troops, also to see the humanitarian side of the war in Ukraine, because Poland has taken in 2 million of the more than 3 million people who fled Ukraine so far. He'll be seeing that. He'll be speaking to Polish politicians and trying to show support for this key US ally, and also showing support for a country that's on the front line of this battle, which has a long border with Ukraine, and showing that we are united as NATO, we are united as the G7, and we are united in terms of the US and the EU working together in terms of that LNG gas deal that we were just talking about, also in terms of the overall policy support provided by Washington to Warsaw. Jill?
Appreciate that update. Ross Cullen is live in Brussels.
Russia has brushed aside the possibility of being excluded from the G20 economic grouping. The Kremlin says it would not be fatal. Many member countries, including the US and Australia, say Russia should be expelled over its military action in Ukraine. The calls have tested Indonesia's leadership of the G20. Jakarta, which will hold the G20 summit later this year in Bali, says it will include Russia at the summit and will conduct the presidency in a neutral and impartial manner. Saiful Bara Ismail with this report.
Indonesia took over the presidency of the G20 from Italy in October last year with high hopes of making the world a better place. A series of year-long meetings have been organized, culminating in the Bali summit in November, where the head of states from the G20 countries are expected to attend. Jakarta sent out invitations for the leaders on 22nd February. 2 days later, one of the G20 members, Russia, invaded its neighbor Ukraine. A number of G20 countries, including the United States, have called for Russia to be expelled from the group. Indonesia, as the head of G20, is seeking a middle ground.
For us, we will conduct our presidency based on what has been done in previous presidency. And of course, once again, that we have always based our diplomacy based on principles. But one thing for sure, that we will remain as a impartial president, and we will try to find solution to any issues that may arise.
Russian President Vladimir Putin plans to attend the Bali summit, which was relayed by the Russian envoy in Jakarta.
G20 is not a forum to discuss or to solve this kind of crises. Actually, it's a forum aimed at improving or economic situation and solving economic mostly problems, and of course expulsion of Russia from this kind of forum will not help these economic problems to be resolved. On the contrary, without Russia it would be difficult to do so.
Kicking Russia out of the G20 may be difficult as it requires the support of all members. China has given its valuable backing for Russia to remain in the grouping.
20国集团是国际经济合作的主要论坛，汇聚了世界主要经济体。俄罗斯是重要成员，任何成员都没有权利开除其他国家的成员资格。
Washington has been vocal on the removal of Russia from G20.
On the latter point, my answer is yes. That depends on the G20. That was raised today, and I raised the possibility if that can't be done, if Indonesia and others do not agree, then we should, in my view, ask to have both Ukraine be able to attend the meetings, as well as basically Ukraine being able to attend the G20 meeting and observe.
One political observer says Indonesia, as the G20 president, should play a more active role in resolving the Ukraine crisis.
Indonesia has become the co-sponsor for UN resolution on Russia's aggression, which was sponsored by the US, meaning that now it's going to be very difficult to say that Indonesia is a neutral and impartial. Indonesia, through its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to try to mediate, making sure that there's a ceasefire, and then once the ceasefires have set, parties have to, negotiate peacefully.
The war in Ukraine may be some 10,000 kilometers away, but the conflict has reached Indonesia's shores. Jakarta has found itself caught in the middle of a tense diplomatic struggle over the Russian aggression in Ukraine. But if it's able to successfully lobby the various stakeholders in this crisis to reach a positive outcome, Indonesia may be long remembered as an effective G20 president. Saiful Ismail, CNA, Jakarta.
And John Beaver joins us live from Riga, Latvia. John, Russia says nothing terrible will happen, in its word, nothing fatal, if it is actually expelled from the G20. But how much more isolation can Moscow take?
Well, yeah, Russia putting a brave face on it, of course. And that quote you just mentioned, that nothing terrible will happen, that was said by Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman. He was very keen to point out that the world is bigger than Europe and the US, and that very much Russia was looking into new policy directions and new markets in other parts of the world. Worth remembering, of course, and we've been hearing about this from Ross in Brussels, that Russia is still selling oil and gas to many EU nations. They are, of course, now demanding rubles for that fuel, which is going to create some problems, but is an attempt to try and prop up the ailing currency. So there's going to be some interest as to whether that happens. Of course, a lot of pushback from their customers when it comes to that change in paying with rubles. But when we're talking about EU countries moving away from Russian oil and gas, we're talking years, we're not talking months. So that, of course, is going to supply Russia still with finances that it needs, despite all these huge sanctions. But as it looks to different markets, of course, Chinese support is going to be vital, and you would expect Russia really to be pivoting towards Asia in terms of trying to establish itself elsewhere in the world as it moves away from Europe. But worth noting as well that Russian sanctions now are really hitting Russian people. There was one report that said prices are up by 6.2% in the last 3 weeks. That was from the Russian Statistics Agency. One anti-government channel said that prices could rise for certain goods as much as 40% in the coming weeks. So we are really starting to see the sanctions hit people on the streets in Russia. But of course, the Kremlin putting a very brave face on it all.
And John, of course, not just economic punishment. Yesterday, we saw NATO announcing that it will beef up its eastern flank, so military punishment as well. Russian military saying it is preparing proposals on responding to this beefing up of the eastern flank. Are we likely to see much more militarization of the borders between Eastern Europe and Russia?
Well, of course, that does look like it's happening. NATO has committed these new battle groups, somewhere in the region of 40,000 troops heading closer to the Russian border. There's been a call in the Baltic states, such as Latvia, where I am now, for a permanent NATO presence here. Remember, of course, the Baltic states, former members of the Soviet Union, they are all too aware of what Russian aggression can lead to. So they are calling for permanent bases here in this edge of Europe. And very much we are seeing this NATO eastward expansion and Russia sending more troops to its western borders. Of course, what we have seen is that as Russia has struggled in Ukraine, it's certainly not been this lightning war that many in Moscow thought it might be. Then, of course, sucking goods and sucking equipment and people into Ukraine itself means that there's less to go around the rest of Russia's border. Russia's border, of course, is absolutely huge, it's worth remembering. So it would be no easy task to beef up the entire border. But certainly here in Eastern Europe, there are fears that we are going to see this militarization of the entire border.
Thanks for that, John Beaver, speaking to us there from Riga, Latvia.